Good evening. My name is Uta Poiga, and I'm the Dean of the College of Social Sciences and Humanities at Northeastern. It's a great pleasure to welcome all of you to our evening's conversation, Racial Literacy History. Let me start with a few housekeeping items. I would first like to remind you to update your Zoom software. For directions on how to update it, please open the chat and refer to the audience instructions inside the chat. Please also note, as you are experiencing this panel discussion, that it is on Zoom webinar, not in Zoom meeting. Today's event, as well as subsequent events at the associated pop-up course, are sponsored by the Presidential Council on Diversity and Inclusion at Northeastern, that the Dean of the Law School, James Hackney, and I co-chair. These events and these efforts build on a tradition of collaboration between student affairs and academics that we very much seek to foster. I want to thank all the colleagues in the series for getting these important university-wide conversations underway. And again, on behalf of the Presidential Council, a warm welcome to all the pop-up students and all of you in the audience. I very much look forward to our discussion today on racial literacy and history. It is a discussion that will provide frames for key developments in Boston and US history, and our speakers will also provide us context for some of their own experiences, as well as context for all of us living, learning, and working in this city. We also see what we are doing here this evening for Boston as applicable to many other locations. And specifically, we see what we are doing as something that can also be taken to the other campuses in Northeastern's global network. Critical awareness, as well as engagement with complex, painful, and often also hopeful histories is important for racial literacy and for global citizenship. It is then a great honor to introduce our moderator for this evening's conversation. Patricia Davis is Associate Professor of Communication Studies and Affiliate Associate Professor of Africana Studies here at Northeastern. Her award-winning research focuses on public memory, identity, race, gender, and representation. She teaches courses on public memory, media ethics, race and gender in the media and in popular culture, as well as on communication and diversity. Dr. Davis, many thanks for framing and moderating the discussion today. Over to you.
Okay, I wanted to say thank you to everyone for joining us tonight. I'm also very happy to be here. And I'm glad that you all have a sense of awareness of the importance of racial literacy, enough of a sense of awareness to have gone through the trouble of engaging in this particular seminar tonight. So once again, my name is Patricia Davis, and I am an Associate Professor in Communication Studies. As Dr. Poiger said, I do currently teach courses in communication and inclusion, communication and gender. At some point in the near future, I will teach a course called History, Memory, and Rhetoric, and a little later, a course on race and representation. So beyond this, more broadly, my work foregrounds the intersection of history, memory, representation, and racial identity. I will begin with the description of a question multiple people asked me a little more than a year ago. I had spent the previous 9 years teaching at Georgia State University and had accepted this position at Northeastern. When I told people of this decision, the question they asked was, why on earth would you ever leave Atlanta to go to Boston? Not what is so great about that job versus your current job, or won't you miss your students at GSU, but rather why exchange living in a city like Atlanta for Boston? The most interesting aspect of this question lie in the fact that I never had to ask the person what she or he meant by that question. All the people who asked me this are, like myself, African American, and there were pretty much culturally coded reasons why they were asking me this. In fact, it was more of a statement than a question. As a further illustration of the meaning behind it, whenever I told a person about my new job and this person happened to be white, the response was much different. It was more along the lines of, "Oh, Boston, lucky you." The explanation for the differing responses is rooted in history, including our memories of particular events that took place in Boston many years ago. From the start, it's important to distinguish between history and memory. History is based on a set of objective facts, what did or didn't happen, though I will qualify that by saying that history itself is not always 100% objective. Memory, on the other hand, is socially constructed, the result of both individual and group interpretations of an historical event or period. When there are group memories of a particular historical event that are passed down through generations and eventually become the memories of those who may not have even been alive at the time the events took place, they are referred to as collective memories or cultural memories. These memories don't necessarily prioritize what happened, but they tend to prioritize what is said to have happened, its meaning at the time, and most importantly, its impact and usefulness in the present and future. And historical knowledge and the influence of memory, including its erasures, is an integral aspect of racial literacy. Today, in this module focused on history, I will discuss one of the aspects of Boston history most connected to the reasons why people were asking me about why I was okay about moving here. I will then follow up with a wider discussion about monuments as part of the reinvigoration of Black Lives Matter and the broader discussions of racial inequality that has emphasized the importance of re-examining history via the monuments that define our national landscapes. In spite of its reputation as a progressive city, Boston has what I refer to as a history problem that, when looked at deeply, is in actuality a memory problem. The reason so many African Americans question my decision to come here is because their collective memories of Boston inform their perception of the city in the present. And what they remember most is the busing crisis of the 1970s, the images of which undercut the city's image, mostly produced through its abolitionist history, as a beacon of progressivism. The crisis began in September of 1974 when, fully 20 years after the Brown v. Board of Education decision, the city of Boston, under court order, began the process of desegregating its public schools. The court had found that, over a decades-long period, the schools in Boston had been intentionally segregated to the point where there were, in effect, two separate and unequal systems, much like those in the South and the rest of the country. As part of the desegregation process, thousands of Black and white students were ordered to take buses to schools outside of their neighborhoods. The reaction to this change was violent, with white parents and their children throwing rocks, eggs, bricks, and other objects at school buses carrying Black children, with the primary areas in which violence occurred being Roxbury and South Boston. The violence persisted for months and eventually years, with the National Guard eventually mobilized to maintain order. Media images of the violence were shocking. An entire country used to seeing such images associated with the South, but not a city like Boston. All of this rendered Boston, South Boston in particular, but really the entire city, as symbolic of racism just as much as any city in the South remembered in terms of the civil rights battles, including Montgomery, Birmingham, and Selma in Alabama, and Little Rock in Arkansas. In fact, Boston was referred to at the time as the Little Rock of the North. These are the memories that have come to define Boston in the eyes of many, and they have superseded its prior image as the cradle of abolitionism. In fact, Stanley Forman's 1976 photo of a white protester attacking a Black man with an American flag on City Hall Plaza has left an indelible mark on perceptions of the city. It certainly formed the perceptions I had of it when I first saw that photo as a high school student many years after it happened, 700 miles away in Virginia, where I grew up. There was even a Simpsons episode focused on Boston, wherein the family traveled there. Some of you might have seen this. I think it's from 2016. And at the end, listed what they saw as the good things about the city, particularly its world-class educational, scientific, and cultural institutions. And then they listed its problems, the horrible weather and the overt racism. And they made a point to say that it was overt, not implicit racism. You may be thinking, well, it's a cartoon. It's not really an indication of reality. However, media productions are spot on in providing current and future generations with the information they need about the social, cultural, and political pulse of the moments in time in which they are produced. So, given the show's popularity and cultural influence and afterlife and syndication for many years, that reputation that Boston that was sustained through that particular episode is not going to change anytime soon. Aside from that, this was an interesting acknowledgement on the part of mainstream pop culture that in spite of the perception of some that Boston is a bastion of progressive thought and action, its history is much more troubled than that reputation suggests. And that's part of the work that Black history does. It troubles otherwise rosy views of spaces and places and allows for greater understanding of what needs to be done to attain a more equitable present and future. Now, another important part of the cultural work that knowledge of this history performs is that it undercuts the image of the civil rights movement as having taken place solely in the South. More specifically, it enables us to situate this history within a larger field of knowledge that encompasses the events characteristic of our contemporary moment and gives us the intellectual tools to evaluate them in ways that work toward racial literacy. There's much to unpack here, but I will focus on only one aspect, the removal of monuments. You may have noticed that a significant part of the racial reckoning in which we are currently engaged involves the removal of monuments to white supremacy. The publicity surrounding these efforts has focused mainly on the South, and rightly so, since most of these monuments are located there. In order to understand the connection they have to current inequalities, it's important to know both the history behind each monument and the functions that monuments perform. They are typically constructed as a means of commemorating an historical figure or event of importance, and because they are often positioned in prominent public spaces, they are meant to communicate the values of the entire communities in which they are located. Because they correspond to memory, more so than history itself, they serve to elevate one particular interpretation of history over others, which is why they're potentially problematic when they venerate prominent figures whose activities involve violence or subjugation or were otherwise geared towards sustaining hierarchies. And that's why their removal has been and is part of movements for racial equality. This is most obvious in the South with the campaigns to remove statues to Robert E. Lee, Stonewall Jackson, and other figures which were put up during the Jim Crow era as reminders to African Americans of their place in the racial order. Most Confederate monuments which celebrate those who fought for a civilization rooted in white supremacy were erected by a group called the United Daughters of the Confederacy, which is still very active, by the way, who were quite clear in their goal to educate future generations of school children about the narrative of the Civil War that suggested that those who fought to preserve slavery were to be honored as heroes. There are also Confederate monuments located all over the country, so I just wanted to make that clear that they're not all located in the South. There are quite a few of them that are located in other parts of the country, including California and northern states like New York, Massachusetts, and so forth. So it's not just the South that celebrates the Confederacy and what it stood for. So that brings up the question, what does Boston's memorial landscape suggest to us about the values of Bostonians? On the one hand, there's the St. Gaudens Monument to the 54th Massachusetts, a prominent Black regiment during the Civil War, located in a very prominent public space on Boston Common. On the other hand, there is Faneuil Hall. Naming buildings and landmarks for historical figures is also a form of erecting monuments, though many people don't think of it that way. Faneuil Hall represents a notable example. As an historic site, it is often referred to as the cradle of liberty, which is ironic considering Peter Faneuil's role in the slave trade. In fact, the building was constructed in part through funds acquired through slave trading. There was a movement begun last year to change the building's name. These efforts are ongoing. Some folks will say, it's just a name. What harm can that do? Or Faneuil Hall is how people have always known it. It's tradition. Why should it change? Underneath these opinions is the perspective that naming is an abstract thing with no connection to people's material circumstances. We could certainly have a discussion about that, and I won't go into any more detail here as there are others who have thoughts on it. But for now, it is important to know the ways in which history and memory in Boston and other cities, and our very own campus for that matter, as well as the enduring legacy of the battles waged long ago, have impacts in the here and now, as the past never stays in the past. It is of the utmost importance to confront history and to make connections between the past and present. And if that history is troubled or uncomfortable, it is even more important to confront it. For in the words of the great Maya Angelou, history, despite its wrenching pain, cannot be unlived, but faced with courage, need not be lived again. So with that said, I'll now turn things over to Dr. Rabinovitch.
Thank you so much, Dr. Davis. That was really wonderful, and I think it's going to be a very fruitful conversation that we're going to have. So my name is Simon Rabinovitch. I teach in the history department and the program in Jewish studies. I teach on a range of topics in Jewish, European, Russian, and legal history. My writing is mostly focused on Jewish political and intellectual history. And I guess most importantly, for the purposes this evening, I'm not a native Bostonian. In fact, I'm not even American. I grew up in Toronto, and so I hopefully bring a valuable outsider's perspective. When I came to Northeastern, which wasn't that long ago, actually, a particular building caught my eye. Just down the street from my office right here in Renaissance Park, on Columbus Avenue, almost at Massachusetts Avenue, is the Columbus Avenue African Methodist Episcopal Zion Church, the AME Zion Church. And I noticed that there's this large Star of David in a sort of circular stained glass window above the door. And, you know, this was sort of a clear giveaway that the church used to be a synagogue. And so I looked into it, and I learned that, you know, that the building is the home of the AME Zion Church and has been since 1902 when it purchased the building, and that it had been the site of contentious battles within the early civil rights movement and early efforts to strategize how to fight for greater Black rights. And most famously was the site of a raucous debate dubbed the Boston Riot between William Monroe Trotter, who was the founder of the Boston Guardian newspaper, and Booker T. Washington, who was then president of the Tuskegee Institute in Alabama. And I learned that this church did indeed purchase the building from a synagogue, from Temple Adath Israel, which was known colloquially at the time as the Columbus Avenue Temple. Also, that this was a breakaway, that the AME Zion Church was a breakaway from an even older church that had been based in what is today the Museum of African American History in the North End, and was the African Meeting House founded in 1806. So to give a little bit of context here, around the turn of the 19th century, or I should say the turn of the 20th century and late 19th century, Boston's neighborhoods were changing, and people were moving up the socioeconomic ladder and moving further away from the city, or further away from the city center, I should say. The north slope of Beacon Hill was known as the West End at the time, and continued down across Cambridge Street into what today is Government Center, but was a residential neighborhood. And that back slope of Beacon Hill was a predominantly African-American neighborhood, and a long-established one. And in the late 19th century, Jews were moving into that neighborhood. It was becoming much more densely populated. Living conditions were declining. And African Americans were seeking more space and better accommodations, and were moving mostly to the South End and to Roxbury. And at the exact same time, Jews were moving into the West End from Eastern Europe directly, but also from the North End. And one of the interesting twists of this story is that the African Meeting House that I mentioned, which was original congregation from which the AME Zion Church split, actually sold its building in 1899 to an Eastern European Jewish congregation that was being founded to form a synagogue. And today, what's called the Vilna Shul, which is now a sort of a cultural museum in Beacon Hill, also in that sort of back slope, the West End, was similarly purchased around the turn of the 20th century from an old African-American church. And what was going on at this time is an interesting exchange of buildings that the African-American community was seeking to improve its living conditions by moving to the South End in Roxbury and selling its churches to incoming Eastern European Jewish communities. And those African-American communities were purchasing the buildings used for synagogues from longer established Jewish communities who were also themselves moving south to Roxbury and west towards Brookline. And you know, the history of Jewish life and African-American life intertwined in the South End was new to me. And this was sort of my introduction when I started working at Northeastern. But I was somewhat more familiar with the story of Jewish and African-American life along Blue Hill Avenue from Roxbury south through Dorchester and Mattapan down to Milton. Jew Hill Avenue, as it was colloquially known at mid-20th century, by the late 1960s had become predominantly African-American. And today, the large synagogues that were built there in the first half of the 20th century are predominantly Black churches, if they're still standing. And I saw teaching at Northeastern as an opportunity to explore these intertwined histories. It really fascinated me. And I created a class, one that I'm currently teaching, called Digital Histories of Ethnic Boston, where in this class, we're going to be creating digitized maps and visualizations that display the transformation of the city at a neighborhood level. And one other thing that I would highlight here that's sort of become evident to me as I've researched the intertwined histories of Jews and African Americans in the city, and which plays very well on what Patricia Davis was talking about in terms of the difference between history and memory, or the way they sometimes conflict, is that the memory of interethnic tension and conflict has obscured and overshadowed really the much bigger story of Jewish and African-American coexistence in the city. Jews and Blacks lived together for long stretches, mostly harmoniously in mixed neighborhoods in the West End, South End, Roxbury, and Dorchester. And starting in the 1920s, but really accelerating in the 1950s, Jews continued a path outward, out of the city, to more space, to better living conditions. And they were able to continue to do so, especially in the 1950s. And this process accelerated in part because they were coming to be seen as white in American society. And the discrimination against them in terms of housing and where they could live was declining. Whereas Blacks continued to face barriers in where they could live due to redlining and discrimination in the sale and rental of property. And I'd add continue to do so. There was a recent Suffolk publication of a study based in Suffolk University, that highlighted the continued housing discrimination and rental discrimination against African Americans in the city. And it's unfortunate to me, as I recently gave a couple of talks about the Jews in Boston to local Jewish community groups, that for many of the elderly Jews who moved out of the Blue Hill Avenue area into the suburbs in the 1950s and the 1960s, so many of their memories are of conflict between Jews and Blacks in Roxbury, and that this sort of dominates their memory of the experience compared to, or the reasons for their leaving those neighborhoods, compared to the social and economic aspirations that historians see as the engine of Jewish suburbanization. That Jews much more left urban areas because they could in search of better living conditions. And that, in fact, like I said before, the history, if you take a long view of Jewish-Black interactions, is very much intertwined and peaceable within the city. So to sum up, I think it makes the task of reconstructing the history of Jewish and Black neighborhoods, their coexistence, their cooperation and fight against unfair housing practices, and of course conflict too, all the more urgent. And I'd add that Northeastern's library is actually playing an important role in this, in its special collections, in particular, one example being the Archive of Freedom House, which was a Black and Jewish community organization in Upper Roxbury devoted to integration. So I think that there's an important story to tell here, and one which I'm very glad to be able to explore with my students at Northeastern, which is so much in the heart of the story itself. And with that, I will pass it on to Ted Landsmark.
Well, and good evening. Thank you very much. These kinds of dialogues are really enlightening for all of the participants, I think, because among other things, we learn about what some of our peers are doing on other parts of the campus. We usually don't have that many opportunities to interact with each other. Based on the first two presentations tonight, I expect that we'll have some very deep and rich additional conversations based upon things I've learned and heard from a variety of communities in and around Boston, including some of the older Jewish community in Boston. I'm Ted Landsmark. I am director of the Kitty and Michael Dukakis Center for Urban and Regional Policy. I oversee the open classroom, and in the spring, I'll be teaching a course on Black leadership. I am also on the board of Boston's planning agency, the BPDA, and I've worked under all of the recent mayors in Boston and with Mayor Kevin White prior to that. I want to share some thoughts about 4 sets of experiences that I've had, all of which relate very directly, not only to Boston as it is today, but to what it is that we think may be takeaways as we move forward to make the city, the region, and our university a better place. I was one of the very first young people to be bused in New York City. Shortly after the Brown versus Board of Education decision came down, the Board of Education in New York City decided that they wanted to experiment to see what the effects might be on young Black children who might be educated in a primarily white school environment. And so I was one of 4 students who was selected to ride public buses 45 minutes each way every day from my home in Harlem to a primarily Jewish school at the northern end of Manhattan in Inwood. And I was in primarily white schools from the 4th grade on, and was bused on public transportation from that point on. It wasn't easy, to be sure. It worked out fine. I became a college president and a lawyer. But at the time when I was being bused, there were clearly certain deficits that took place. I spent a lot of my time as a kid on public buses. I lost my connections in both Harlem and really wasn't in a position to make connections at the school on the other end because I had to leave in order to get back home. And there were major, I think, disadvantages to forming a social life. But at the same time, I was exposed to young people whose aspiration levels far exceeded anything that I saw in Harlem. I met parents who were lawyers and doctors and accountants and other kinds of professionals. And at that point in time, the assumption was that if you were bright growing up in Harlem, the best you could aspire to be would be some sort of public service worker. And so ultimately, I found myself really living out what W.E.B. Du Bois had said about developing a double consciousness. I knew the life and culture of Harlem, but I also knew the life and culture of one of New York City's Jewish communities. And I came to develop an understanding of what it meant to make the transition on a daily basis from a Black community to a white community, and then back to a Black community. And that wider cultural experience at an early age made me much more resilient to many of the kinds of things that I encountered later in life. By the time I got to college, it seemed almost inevitable that I would be involved in civil rights activities. When I got to Yale, each year, 1,050 students were admitted, and in the year I was admitted, there were only 16 of us who were African American. And so we were distributed across the campus to make sure that all of the white students had some experience of seeing and working with Black students on campus. And because I had been to the original March on Washington, and my family was heavily involved in church activities, it made sense for me to become involved in civil rights activities on that campus. And that entailed my making a trip to Selma, Alabama, and playing a very small role in the march at Selma. One of the things I took away from that is that while there were a great many people who were at the front of the march, being photographed and risking their lives to be there, there were a lot of us behind the scenes. I made sandwiches and made phone calls to do fundraising. And in many respects, we experienced a lot of the same terrors that the leadership faced. I remember very specifically that there was one evening when I got lost on the back streets of Selma. And we had been informed that there were night riders who were cruising the street looking for Northerners to beat up and potentially to kill. And I spent part of that evening hiding in the bushes and learning a lot about myself and about courage. But what I really learned was that I had to confront some of my own biases about African Americans and African Americans both in the North and in the South. You see, part of the reality is that we all have certain biases. And growing up in New York, I had pretty much always been taught that Blacks in the South were not as ambitious as we were. Were not as successful as we were. And my exposure to Black culture in Selma, Alabama was for me a revelation, in that I came to understand that in the South, there was much more Black economic development and cultural development than I had ever experienced in the North, and that I really need to get my head straight about the connections between African Americans around the country. The third thing I'll mention is City Hall Plaza and the events that transpired there. And we have an image of my being attacked by a group of young anti-busing students in Boston in 1976. The photograph is well known. It's had an impression on a lot of people around the country for a long time. But for me, what became important about that photograph, it was not so much the photograph itself, it was what I had to learn about the aftermath of that photograph and what one does. I learned that if you're going to be called upon in a press conference, you always have to be ready. The events around a person will happen very fast. And sometimes it requires a kind of courage, a kind of courageous statement that needs to be made. And that statement isn't always going to be made in a big public setting. Sometimes it's made over a Thanksgiving supper because of what someone may say about race and the courage that we have to show to address that what they've said may be grossly inappropriate. And I also learned that it's important to seize every moment of opportunity. And the moment of opportunity that was presented to me at that time was one to draw a distinction between the young people who attacked me and the political leaders who had put them up to that. And in the years since, I've learned that it's essential to learn to collaborate, often with people who you think initially are not going to be your collaborators, but who actually have their hearts and minds in the right place. And the last point I'll make is that this past summer, I undertook some research for FEMA on how New England could prepare for a post-COVID history. And part of what I encountered through that research was the deep legacy of racism that permeates all of New England, which likes to think of itself as being highly progressive and inclusive. The reality is that in most of our major private sector institutions, and by that I mean the real estate industry, the high-tech industry, higher education as an industry, the tops of many of our cultural organizations, there have been long-term patterns of institutional racism that have excluded people of color and women from leadership roles throughout this part of the world. And we're now at a tipping point, where thanks to Black Lives Matter and a number of demonstrations that have taken place, there is a rising consciousness of the need for all of us to come together to have this kind of dialogue and to move forward. So this is, for me, a great opportunity to interact with my peers, and with students and with the wider community that Northeastern is in. We are, after all, located in Roxbury, and to figure out the ways where we can serve one another better. And with that, I turn the conversation over to Dr. Nieves.
Thank you, Dr. Landsmark. Good evening. My name is Ángel Nieves, and I only recently joined the Northeastern faculty this past July as Professor of Africana Studies, History, and Digital Humanities, with a joint appointment in the Department of Culture, Societies, and Global Studies and the Department of History. I want to begin with some of my personal history, a history that I hope will help to frame the many different ways that racial literacy becomes manifest in the daily lives of some Black and brown men like myself in the United States. I'm personally uneasy with the term racial literacy, in part because although my parents were in many ways functionally illiterate, both having only attended elementary schools, our literacy as a family took on many different forms and meanings over the years. When asked to be a part of this pop-up session on history, I was immediately reminded of the ways I was both taught and experienced racial literacy and have come to understand it more fully as a historian of the African diaspora. As the gay son of two Puerto Rican Americans who migrated to Chicago and then New York in the 1950s, I've since a very early age lived in two worlds, a kind of double consciousness. And here I'm explicitly evoking early terminology from pioneering African American sociologist and human rights activist W.E.B. Du Bois about the white heteronormative racist world we all lived in. We were very much temporary island guests in their world, contrasted with the safe, nurturing, although very loud, world made at home by my parents. My father was the superintendent in a predominantly Jewish-owned co-op building in the Flushing neighborhood of Queens in New York City in the 1970s and 1980s. We lived rent-free as one of my father's benefits or perks that supplemented his modest middle-class income. With the deaths of Trayvon Martin, Breonna Taylor, George Floyd, and so many other countless victims of systematic police violence, the white mainstream world has become uncomfortably aware of the talk that young men of color, in particular, are taught at a very early age about how they should interact when approaching or confronted by those in positions of power and authority in the US. I honestly can't remember the actual moment when I received the talk, an early history lesson from my father who looked incredibly indigenous with his darker skin. But among my earliest memories are all the many rules we had to follow in our daily interactions, rules grounded in the historical trauma of his own experiences as a young adult on the mainland. As if in the words of W.E.B. Du Bois, we were somehow the problem in the outside world. Both my mother and sister also had to abide by these rules, despite all three of us looking like or even signifying as honorary whites in our outward appearance. Although my sister and I had dark, unruly brown hair, my mother's was, however, dyed clairol, honey blonde. Our skin color often allowed us to pass without women suddenly clutching their purses more tightly or crossing the street when we were finally noticed approaching someone on the sidewalk, and move about their world without too many second glances. What often gave us away, however, was talking in Spanish, my sister in Spanglish, to my mother who refused to speak in her broken English unless very briefly and when it was absolutely necessary, hoping to not reveal her racial or ethnic background. The most gut-wrenching of those rules, and these were grounded in historical realities, and trust me, there were many, was how we should act or behave on the elevator during the short ride to our apartment in this post-World War II building of only 6 floors. If we were on the elevator and speaking to my mom, often entirely in Spanish, we were expected to code switch, change our use of languages, and resume our conversation in hushed voices. My mother was, however, to stop speaking, and the 2 native English speakers, my sister and I, should greet anyone who enters the small 5-foot by 4-foot elevator cab in loud, very clear-throated American English, and to abandon any conversation we were having with our mother in Spanish. Those experiences had a profound impact on me because my history of racial literacy was very much tied to a place and to a location. Mine included this elevator cab in an apartment building I once called home. Perhaps my personal history of racial literacy helps explain how the built environment, the physical world around us, the architecture, person-made or otherwise, with its single-family homes, apartment buildings, churches, schools, public art, and graffiti make up an important part of our individual and collective identities. As an adult, much of my work over the past 15 years has been in Johannesburg, South Africa, working with the local Soweto community in their efforts to tell the stories of forcibly erased places where anti-apartheid activists lived and worked to end the control of an all-white minority over a Black and brown majority. I look at these sites where the nationalist government often destroyed places of community significance and where massive social movements occurred as a form of state-based racial and spatial violence. Slide, please. I want to draw your attention now to a similar site here in Boston, and one that was also erased very recently and is no longer extant. A site along Warren Street that since 2014 was for many Roxbury residents a site of commemoration and an instantly recognizable part of the urban fabric of a vibrant African American and Latinx community. We know that parts of Roxbury weren't always Black and brown, and in the latter part of the 19th century, other large ethnic communities laid claim to some of those very same streets. Unfortunately, so much of this history has been overshadowed by local and national efforts to commemorate a more sanitized or less messy version of Boston's revolutionary period, while failing to see the very long line through of activism in the city, something that can be traced from the Black-led abolitionist movement to the more contemporary anti-gentrification and Black Lives Matter activists of today. In the early morning hours of July 24th in Roxbury, a mural with the image of Nelson Mandela by street artists Richard Demi-Five Gomez and Thomas Quest Burns was bulldozed. This image of Nelson Mandela, South Africa's first democratically elected president, were surrounded by the words Roxbury Love to commemorate his 1990 visit to Boston. Northeastern law professor Margaret Burnham, who was a Boston-based leader in the Free South Africa and Free Mandela movement, has recalled Mandela's visit. Quote, "It was electric. Everyone felt it was historic. We were living that history at that moment. We were sharing space with one of the world's great statesmen and peacemakers, perhaps one of the most unique leaders, certainly in the 20th century. And here he was in our midst. He was both extraordinary and ordinary at the same time." End of quote. The Love mural with Mandela's image held for many an iconic status in the neighborhood and helped usher in a veritable explosion of new public art in Boston. With scarce notice to the public, this mural was destroyed by a construction company seeking to redevelop a site for mixed income housing just a short distance from what is now considered the cultural center of the neighborhood, a place known as Union Square. This history of removal and displacement, because of the legacy of urban renewal and its latest incarnation as millennial gentrification, is a complex, messy, and fraught story that is also often overshadowed by other more palatable consumerist histories. I'm only now learning about this history as a new Boston resident who has already begun to question out loud in meetings with stakeholders and local public history practitioners my own uneasiness about the ways that some of these histories still remain very neatly packaged for tourists who, for argument's sake, visit parts of New England while also taking in the fall foliage. Take, for example, Boston's continued role in the transatlantic slave trade, despite a history filled with anti-slavery activism of women and men, both Black and white, who risked everything to end slavery, but weren't necessarily in favor of full citizenship rights for all. It is this memorial to Boston's critical involvement in the global anti-apartheid movement that now remains largely lost and hidden in the face of mounting evictions, lost wages due to the COVID pandemic, and the long-haul impact of redevelopment and gentrification on Black and brown communities across the city. To understand Boston's history of anti-apartheid activism, we must also consider the many networks of activists who molded their social movement while also espousing a Pan-Africanist ideology. Documenting the history of divestment from South Africa's gold and diamond mining in the 1980s could restore our understanding of how interconnected rural and urban areas across Southern Africa were, even to an ostensibly progressive center like Boston, in the fight for freedom from apartheid and the last vestiges of colonial rule. In the face of countless losses of sites such as the Love mural, I want to close this brief talk with a quote from W.E.B. Du Bois that circles back to my early experiences with racial literacy. Du Bois wrote in 1897, quote, "They approach me in a half-hesitant sort of way, eye me curiously or compassionately, and then, instead of saying directly, 'How does it feel to be a problem?' they say, 'I know an excellent colored man in my town,' or 'I fought at Mechanicsville,' or 'Do not these Southern outrageous lynchings make your blood boil?' At these I smile, or am interested, or reduce their inner boiling to a simmer, as the occasion may require. To the real question, how does it feel to be a problem, I answer seldom with a word." End of quote. Thank you. Now back to Dr. Davis.
So that completes all the presentations that our panelists had for us. tonight. So at this point, we'll go ahead and ask some questions. So I have two questions that I want to ask the panelists. And of course, the panelists are all welcome to ask each other questions as well. And then at that point, we'll go ahead and open it up for for everyone else watching to ask their own questions in the chat function. And I'll look at the questions and I'll read them out. So the first question I want to ask is, how does Boston's history impact, we've gotten a little bit of this from the presentations, but I'd be interested in hearing a little bit more detailed answers on how does Boston's history, or maybe even broader historical currents that are occurring all over the country and globally, impact the experiences of Boston residents today, particularly those of color.
Well, I'll just jump in by saying that it is ever present in numerous forms. And I say that because if you look at a community such as East Boston, where the airport is, which is a very diverse community, but where when we hold public meetings, translators need to be provided in both Spanish and Arabic. Boston's history, and its racial history in particular, is one that influences the level of community activism that one sees across the city. It's not just taking place in Roxbury, but it's also taking place in parts of Dorchester and certainly in East Boston. And there is an oral history that's passed down from family to family, from old established families to recently arrived immigrants, within community organizations, that basically says that if you think back to racial and cultural movements off of Beacon Hill and across the city, there's always been a kind of exploitation, a kind of disenfranchisement that people of color have experienced, and that there is an ongoing need to fight back against that, particularly because that exclusion from leadership roles in the economic portion of the community is part of what has disempowered communities in ways where it is now very difficult for a family of color to be able to buy a house anywhere in or near the city. So the racial history is one that shows up in the schools, it shows up in economic development, it shows up in who the business owners are, and it certainly shows up in who occupies the professional ranks in the city in ways that clearly need to be contested at this point and fundamentally changed.
Do the other two panelists have any responses they would like to offer?
Well, I'd say in terms of the question of the impact of global events right now on the people of the city of Boston, I think one of the problems in Boston is the extent of the residential segregation within the city is so great that often communities in their own neighborhoods are not even aware of diverse neighborhoods, not far from their homes. And this extends to the student population as well, the extent to which students stay in their own student communities and often not experience the rest of the city, I think is a problem. And so, with my students, I'm really encouraging them to get out and explore neighborhoods and to think about some of the things that people have talked about in this panel, but also these issues about commemoration and memorialization and the challenges to do it properly. I'll stop there. So if Ángel has something to add.
Yeah, I think for me, the one history that provides a kind of global perspective, but also really hits on this notion of a longer sort of understanding of history is its immigration, is that sort of migrant experience in the city of Boston. I think if we were to find more of those common points and talk about that, from being forced through slavery, being forced because of access to work more contemporaneously for Latinx communities, trying to find jobs. And I would say even now in this kind of COVID period, the lack of jobs and how people continue to be moving in and out of the city to try to make ends meet for their families. So I find that sort of immigration narrative as one particularly important one. I think that can connect all of the stories together and make us understand that we are a lot more alike in ways that we don't often talk about. And here's one way we can do that.
And I would just add as a footnote to that, there are a great many kids living in the city itself. We're not talking about our students who have never been into downtown Boston. They are afraid to go into downtown Boston. They describe downtown as, oh yeah, that's the white area and I'm not welcome there. We are on a seacoast. We're a maritime city, and yet the vast majority of kids in the city have never been on a boat, don't recognize that there are maritime opportunities that might exist for them. And it's because the segregated communities have essentially isolated kids of color from what the real job opportunities might be in a way where they are afraid to even consider what some of the opportunities are that exist in downtown Boston.
Okay, wonderful. I do have another question, but let me just go ahead and go to some, because we've got a couple of questions here from the audience, and let me just go ahead and bring those up before, and we can get to, because my question asks, my second question points more towards action. So let's, it's probably better left to the end. So let's get to some of these questions here. Let's see. I'm curious about the Boston community's response to the current racial unrest in COVID-19 and how it's manifesting in the built environment. For example, in New York City, we are seeing white flight, but also the reclaiming of the built environment via murals and graffiti in areas that were undergoing gentrification. In the Lower East Side, for example, by folks who cannot leave, Latinx and Black workers who make the city run. Are you seeing this in Boston? And that's a question that anyone can answer, but it was directed more towards Dr. Nieves. I mean, I guess you partially answered it, but maybe you could expand on that aspect of your response a little bit.
Sure. One of the things that one can see, and it's really just from walking around those communities, is to see that, in fact, there's an awful lot of local signage that folks are putting up to sort of mark, where their particular political perspectives are coming from. But I think we're also seeing the growth of local artists and sort of the reburgeoning of art being made on walls as graffiti. And so it's similar in a lot of ways to what's going on in New York City, maybe at a smaller scale, but you can notice it, but you actually have to pay attention to what you're looking at as you're sort of walking around, because it's not in some of the most obvious of places. So I think a careful sort of look at the walls between buildings and in empty parking lots, you begin to see some of that really amazing work that is sort of revealing of the commentary about the current political state of our country and really responding in a lot of ways to COVID, immigration, and various other topics.
And I would add that a number of artists of color in Boston have really seized this moment to present more of their own work. There's a street mural just a couple of blocks from our campus in Roxbury that has gone up. And interestingly, some of the larger cultural institutions and foundations, including the Boston Foundation and the Museum of Fine Arts have provided the funding to make those kinds of murals possible within the community. It also needs to be remembered that a lot of what is now appearing is in the form of performance, as well as what's going on in terms of the built environment. And I would just say as a last note on the sad disappearance of the mural that we've talked about earlier, that mural probably should never have gone on that particular site. The community and the city's agencies knew for years that that site would be developed for housing, market rate and affordable. And the developer is a Black developer. The contractor who tore the mural down was a Black contractor. It does say that if we're going to create these kinds of commemorations, as hopefully there will be more, we need to select our sites in a way where there's a very low probability that the site will either be destroyed or marred in the name of building housing in a community that needs more of that kind of housing.
Okay, well, I'll go ahead and move on to another question. Can the panelists address the origins of racial segregation in Boston due to redlining and other discriminatory practices, and what the city can do to address segregation going forward? Okay, Dr. Landsmark.
Well, racism goes back even before redlining, but redlining in Boston was particularly egregious. And in some respects, we see it continuing even now as efforts are being made to get our local suburbs, as was the case during busing, to open up their housing patterns to create more opportunities for affordable housing and for people of color to move into those communities. There have been numerous instances where Boston Celtics players have sought to buy or rent houses in our close-in adjacent suburbs and have been thwarted by that. And Governor Baker, to his credit, has initiated efforts to get some of our local areas that have long used de facto segregation to exclude people of color from their neighborhoods. He's tried to break that down. And I personally find it heinous that if you look at all of the real estate ads, for example, and look at who the real estate brokers are, both in terms of residential and commercial real estate, you rarely, if ever, see a person of color who's involved in the real estate industry. So what we're trying to break apart is complicated by zoning factors, by financing factors, by the availability to people of color of down payments and a range of other things. And if there were really a simple way of solving this, it would have been done. But I will say that the banks and a number of public agencies have come together to find ways to provide down payments for families that are just starting out, to diversify the type of housing that's available, to modify zoning in ways that open things up, and also to have some frank conversations with the real estate industry in a way that brings them along in the same way that we see other parts of the economy beginning to get woke, in effect, and to recognize that historic patterns need to be eliminated.
Okay, does anybody else have a response?
Sorry, Ángel, were you about to say something? Yeah, I would just to add to what Dr. Landsmark was saying, which is all completely correct, that and there was a comment about in the chat about or a couple comments asking why or how it played out, segregation played out, that African Americans were prevented from leaving certain neighborhoods. like Dr. Landsmark said, there was particularly egregious redlining coordinated by the municipal government with the banks and the real estate industry. But also to add to what he's saying about it continuing, the Suffolk University study that I mentioned was a long-term study which sent whites and blacks into attempt to rent apartments through rental agencies, that showed that it was 2 times harder for an African American just to get an appointment to see an apartment compared to somebody who was white. So this is a continued problem, clearly. But I would also add to this, part of this has to do with longer term failures on the part of the city to annex its suburbs, right? Which has allowed towns like Brookline and Newton essentially to exist as bubbles within what is functionally the city of Boston, and that has, whether intentionally or not, continued segregation. I remember, I mean, I don't want to go on, but I remember the superintendent of the schools of Boston a number of years ago, when a study about the continued segregation in the city of Boston in the schools was asked by it on NPR about sort of what is the city of Boston doing about, what is BPS doing about it? And her response was, "You have the wrong superintendent on this show. We can only do as best as we can do for the city, for the residents of the city of Boston." And for a comment that was put in the text about, you know, what I said in terms of the better living conditions and the search for better living conditions, and if I phrased it that way, that would, you know, that actually implies something about these urban neighborhoods. If I did, I apologize, and that's not what I meant, but rather that the perception among Jews at the time was that they valued space, and they valued more than anything the social status that they believed would be achieved through moving to these places. However, moving out of neighborhoods like the West End, the North End, to places like Roxbury was actual better living conditions, like plumbing and fewer people from apartments and things like that.
You know, there are great examples of other cities, and I'm sorry that I'm not as familiar with Boston in this regard, but there are great examples of redevelopment that are very much tied with and into community groups and in a community engaged process that really looks to not just redevelop housing, but also find the ways to include jobs, to include business, to include other factors that are really, really important, including schools, in an effort to make better neighborhoods. So I think there's some great examples out there. I always think of the city of New Orleans and some of the work I've done with women activists living in public housing and how they work together with developers to redevelop their communities in a comprehensive, long-term kind of way. I also want to say that it's important to realize, and I think my colleagues have highlighted here, that redlining was very much a part of the real estate industry. And I think we really need to examine and get at the histories of the real estate of the real estate companies and what it is that they actually did. I mean, if you think about cities like Washington, DC, or even in New York, you know, the real estate market caters to temporary folks who they want to see move in. And sometimes if we think about it in cities like Washington and DC, it's often the LGBT community who have disposable income in large part, who they then use as sort of the gentrifiers. And then they find a new neighborhood, you know, the real estate markets to then develop. So I think there's a real important history to get at. And I think it needs to be one that engages also the real estate market in a comprehensive way to find out, you know, and I think it's part of the dirty history of cities that might be kind of hard to get at, but I think there's enough documentary evidence to do some of that work to try to understand that.
And also just to elaborate on what Dr. Rabinovitch said, Boston is actually a very small city. It is 1/4 the size of Brooklyn. It is a quarter the size of the Bronx. And if Boston were structured the way most other major American cities are structured, Boston would also include Brookline and Cambridge and Quincy and Chelsea, and a lot of close-in suburbs where people have run away to in order to avoid living in neighborhoods that they felt were changing in ways where they were getting darker and more diverse. And so that really argues, given that we're unlikely to change those political jurisdictions, that we need regional solutions to addressing these problems. And also on the issue of housing, one of the questions that's come up is what Northeastern students can do to help in terms of offsetting some of the effects of gentrification. And there, what I have to say is what I had to say to myself when I went south, and I had to confront some of my own, not only biases, but some of my own contributions to not understanding what was going on racially in the country. Most of the gentrification that occurs around Northeastern is not taking place as a matter of formal policy on the part of the university. It's market forces that are driven by students themselves who've moved into the neighborhoods, and in moving into the neighborhoods have increased rents and changed the nature of those neighborhoods. So what I've always advised students is that the first thing that you need to think about is not so much moving into other parts of the city, but really to try to be a good neighbor to the people who are there. Use the local businesses, find out who your neighbors are. When it snows, be one of the first people out with a shovel to try to help one of your neighbors shovel out. Gentrification is a market-driven force, but the people who are participating as gentrifiers can also ease the impact of their presence in the community by becoming a part of it. And by helping to contribute to it, as many of our students do, for example, by running sports leagues on Mission Hill, or by offering tutoring to kids in Roxbury.
Okay, there are several questions here, I'll try to get to all of them, but I do have one that can serve as that connects to this particular aspect of our discussion, from someone who is a Boston, who's a longtime Boston resident. I spent most of my formative years as a resident of Mattapan. When my family moved there from Jamaica Plain in the early 80s, we witnessed the end of the transition of the community described by Dr. Rabinovitch. My question is about the messaging that occurred then and still now about what constitutes as better living conditions. We see this play out in systems such as Metco, where students are bused one way for a better education, but their families don't live or can't access housing in those same areas, which reinforces messages of inferiority, power, belonging, and community. So what was seen as being constitutive of better living conditions?
So for in the earlier migrations, it was better living conditions when they were moving in to the South End, or in particular to Roxbury. The living conditions, like in the Lower East Side in New York in the period of major Jewish migration there, were bad because it was overcrowded. There wasn't sufficient plumbing, and there were sweatshops and things like that. So that migration really was for parks and plumbing and slightly fewer people for within an apartment. I would say that the move to the suburbs, or it was at the time, that was Roxbury, Dorchester, Mattapan. Those were streetcar suburbs that were being developed. When Jews moved out of there. I don't think it was as much, if I use the term better living conditions, that wasn't correct, because I don't think that was the issue. I think it was socioeconomic ladder climbing, right? They could move in. The discrimination barriers were coming down, as I mentioned, as they were increasingly becoming to seen as white, be seen as white within American society. And not every golf club was taking Jews in the 50s, but enough were that Jews felt comfortable moving further out into the suburbs and perceived themselves to be moving up the sort of socioeconomic ladder, especially in terms of status within the United States. And I think that was a major factor towards for migration. I remember reading in a memoir, essentially, I won't get into the names of the delis, but that all the dates were happening at essentially suburban delis rather than G&G, which was the one on Blue Hill Avenue, because nobody would take their date to G&G because that's didn't have sufficient status. They had to go out to sort of the suburban delis to wow their dates. So I think that this was partly it was about space but a lot of it was, of course, a status driven migration. But I do completely agree that the language around how urban neighborhoods within the city of Boston, the language that's used to describe urban neighborhoods within the city of Boston is very problematic and does reinforce or doesn't message correctly and needs to change.
And to that, I would add that even as white families moved out of Mattapan, Haitian families in particular began to move in and created a very strong and vital middle-class Haitian community there that ultimately ended electing a state rep who is Haitian. And we're seeing some similar patterns occurring at this moment in East Boston, for example, where the Latinx population and now the Arabic population have moved in, are beginning to establish themselves through their businesses in those neighborhoods and have fundamentally changed what used to be thought of as an exclusively Italian neighborhood.
And if I could just add one more small point, at my outsider's perspective, from somebody who can't vote in elections, my plea for people to vote. But if I look as an outsider in terms of the differences in segregation in large cities in Canada versus in the United States, well, the economic safety net does a lot to encourage integration. Now, Canadian cities have their problems too. I'm not going to sugarcoat this, but of course, a higher minimum wage, subsidized preschool and nursery education, healthcare, all of these things that would make historically discriminated and underprivileged communities better off would also help integration. But that's from somebody who can't vote.
Okay. And this question connects to the question that I was going to ask at the end. So we could go ahead and talk about it now. How should we as students and faculty reckon with how Northeastern as an organization participates in the erasure and shifting of the collective memory of the city and of its students? And as an example, they gave with the erasure of the memory of the African-American Master Artist in Residence program and with framing of gentrification done by NEU. So what can we do in terms of reforming the university? Dr. Rabinovitch?
Well, I'm new to, I feel like passing this one to Dr. Landsmark, the seasoned veteran at Northeastern and somebody closely connected to public policy issues. I feel like he'd be better suited to answer that. And I'm not trying to punt here, but I just feel like he'd be better with that, to handle that question first.
No, I understand. I'm sorry, I didn't mean to put you on the spot. I saw your little cube was lit up, and it was
No, not at all. I just I think Ted, I think you would be better to handle this one first.
Well, I'll just say that the response can and must take place on two levels. As individuals, everyone who's associated with Northeastern has a skill that can be contributed to improve the lives of people in adjacent and wider communities. So we have folks who are keeping the Roxbury Ballet alive, and they're our students. They're keeping the baseball league on Mission Hill alive, and those are our students. They're students who are volunteering their time to work with squash busters or to do tennis lessons on the Carter Playground. And many of our students can devote even small portions of time to working with any of a range of community agencies that are affiliated with the university through our community engagement offices. And that means tutoring, it means providing legal services, it means providing consulting services to small businesses through our entrepreneurship programs. It certainly means working on health disparities with all of our sports and health programs that serve communities. The fact is that we have a number of ways for students to participate. And then there's the institutional level, and that is to say, there are developments that move forward and will be moving forward into the future. And at a recent retreat that was held this past summer by our senior administrators, we heard from folks who had been involved with institutional development by Columbia University in Morningside Heights in Harlem. And there was a lot to be learned from that about how an institution can share its resources financially in terms of supporting housing, and certainly in terms of supporting programs within the community that empower those communities. But we have to start by listening, and we have to start by organizing ourselves in a way that makes it easier for students and for the institution to interact with the community. And we need to be much more transparent and open so that people in those communities don't feel as though we're an enclave. And that means opening up ourselves both physically in terms of the built environment as the university builds things, but it also means, as has been the case, working on the voter registration drive. We're working on getting organizations in the community to complete census forms. There are a variety of ways that an institution with the kinds of resources that Northeastern has located in Roxbury can work with educational groups, Roxbury Community College, the local vocational school, can work with libraries, can work with community groups to help them develop in ways that are not colonial and that help to further empower those communities.
Yeah, I mean, I have just one very quick suggestion, and it comes from a place of relative ignorance about Northeastern's admissions policies. I've only been here for a year, but admissions, that these changes can be made through admissions to ensure that the university is taking people from the neighborhood and that students from the neighborhood are represented and can afford to go to the university.
All right, wonderful. We're actually over the time that we were supposed to end. So I'm going to end it very shortly, but I just wanted to ask Dr. Nieves if he had anything he wanted to say before we end, if you wanted to respond to that question, or otherwise we can just.
Sure. Thank you, Dr. Davis. One of the things that we're tangibly trying to do, and this is going to be an effort on the part of the College of Social Sciences and Humanities and the University at large, is to begin what we're calling the Social Justice Studio in an effort to try to capture these particular histories of displacement and to honor those stories, and then to find ways of tying that to reparative justice, how we can find ways to really work in community and with community to repair those relationships through the sort of recording and valuing of the histories of these local communities, not just in the Boston area, but in other contexts as well. I think between the work that the history department is doing and the work that we're doing in cultural societies and global studies and in some of the other places around campus, I think we can do this kind of work and be much more responsible and be the kind of good neighbor that does the work that Dr. Landsmark in particular talked about in trying to sort of improve all sorts of ways of moving these relationships forward.
And I would say one last thing, and that is that the School of Public Policy is actively involved with urban resilience efforts, education, analysis, and those are ways of involving community groups in preparing young people for the green jobs of the future. And that becomes a way that the institution and the faculty and students within it can help all of our communities become more sustainable and more resilient.
All right, thank you very much. This was a wonderful discussion. I think everyone got a lot out of it. I wanted to again extend a thank you to all of the panelists and all of everyone else out there who joined us this evening. Good night.